predetermined frameworks that guide your thinking process when your natural cognitive abilities are compromised by pressure. Having a systematic approach reduces the cognitive load of deciding how to think about a problem, allowing you to focus your limited mental resources on the actual analysis. One powerful protocol is the OODA loop, developed by military strategist John Boyd. OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. Under pressure, you systematically observe the situation. Orient yourself by understanding the context and your objectives. Decide on a course of action and act decisively while remaining ready to restart the cycle as conditions change. This framework prevents you from rushing into action without adequate analysis, while also preventing you from getting stuck in analysis paralysis. It provides structure for thinking under pressure while maintaining the flexibility to adapt as situations evolve. For complex decisions under pressure, use the rapid decision-making matrix. List your main options. Identify the 3 most important criteria for evaluating those options, and quickly score each option on each criterion. This forces you to be explicit about your priorities and provides a structured way to compare alternatives even when you don't have time for exhaustive analysis. The matrix prevents you from being overwhelmed by complexity while ensuring that you consider multiple factors rather than making decisions based on the most salient or emotionally compelling single factor. Temporal thinking becomes especially important under pressure. When you feel rushed, your natural tendency is to focus entirely on immediate consequences while ignoring long-term implications. This leads to decisions that solve immediate problems but create bigger problems later. Counter this by implementing the 10-10-10 rule. For any significant decision under pressure, quickly consider how you'll feel about each option in 10 minutes, 10 months, and 10 years. This forces you to maintain temporal perspective even when immediate pressures are screaming for attention. Sometimes the pressure itself is artificial or self-imposed. Many urgent decisions aren't actually urgent when examined carefully. Before accepting time pressure as real, ask whether the deadline is truly fixed or whether it's possible to buy more time for better analysis. Often, spending a small amount of time negotiating for more decision time will dramatically improve the quality of your eventual decision. The key is distinguishing between real deadlines that can't be moved and artificial deadlines that exist primarily to create pressure. When deadlines are truly fixed, focus on making good enough decisions rather than perfect decisions. The enemy of good decisions under pressure isn't imperfection, it's perfectionism. Perfectionism leads to analysis paralysis, missed deadlines, and default outcomes that are worse than any conscious choice you could have made. Good enough decision-making requires identifying the minimum viable criteria for an acceptable decision and choosing the first option that meets those criteria rather than continuing to search for the theoretically optimal solution. Another critical skill is recognizing when to defer decisions. Not every urgent request requires an immediate decision. Sometimes the best response to pressure is to clearly communicate when you'll make the decision and what information you need to make it well. This approach often reveals that many supposedly urgent decisions become irrelevant if you wait, or that better options become available once the artificial urgency subsides. Strategic thinkers understand that declining to make premature decisions is itself a form of decision-making. Chapter 7.
Equity open.
Pattern recognition and strategic anticipation. The ability to recognize patterns before they become obvious to others is perhaps the most valuable skill in strategic thinking. Expert practitioners in every field, from chess grandmasters to successful investors to skilled diagnosticians, share this capacity to see meaningful patterns in apparent complexity and use those patterns to anticipate future developments. Pattern recognition operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the surface level, you notice recurring sequences of events, similar configurations of factors, or familiar dynamics playing out in new contexts. At deeper levels, you recognize the underlying structures, incentives, and forces that generate these surface patterns. The most powerful pattern recognition combines both specific domain expertise and general principles that transfer across different areas. When you understand both the particular patterns of your specific field and the universal patterns that appear everywhere, you develop what could be called meta-pattern recognition. The ability to see patterns in how patterns form and evolve. Developing pattern recognition begins with systematic observation and memory cultivation. Most people observe their environment passively, noticing only what directly affects them or what's obviously dramatic. Strategic pattern recognition requires active, structured observation, where you deliberately look for connections, cycles, and recurring themes. Start by identifying the key variables in your domain and tracking how they change over time. If you're interested in business patterns, you might track economic indicators, consumer behavior trends, technology adoption cycles, and competitive dynamics. If you're focused on personal relationships, you might observe communication patterns, conflict cycles, trust-building sequences, and emotional rhythms. The key is moving beyond anecdotal observation to systematic data collection. Keep records of what you observe. Look for recurring themes across different time periods and contexts, and test your pattern hypotheses against subsequent events. Historical analysis provides the foundation for pattern recognition. Current events always feel unique and unprecedented, but most seemingly novel situations are variations of patterns that have played out many times before in different contexts. Studying history helps you recognize these deeper patterns and avoid being misled by surface differences. For business strategy, study how previous companies have responded to technological disruption, economic cycles, and competitive threats. For personal development, study how others have navigated career transitions, relationship challenges, and major life changes. For social and political understanding, study how societies have dealt with similar pressures and conflicts throughout history. The goal isn't to assume that history repeats exactly, but to understand the underlying dynamics that tend to recur in different forms. As Mark Twain supposedly said, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Leading indicators are early signals that suggest larger patterns are beginning to unfold. These are changes that occur before the main trend becomes visible to most observers. Identifying reliable leading indicators gives you significant strategic advantages because you can position yourself advantageously before the broader pattern becomes apparent. In economic contexts, leading indicators might include changes in credit conditions, early shifts in consumer sentiment, or emerging technologies that could disrupt existing business models. In organizational contexts, Leading indicators might include changes in key personnel, shifts in resource allocation, or early customer feedback on new initiatives. The challenge with
Order
leading
filled.
indicators is distinguishing meaningful signals from random noise. Not every early change represents the beginning of a larger pattern. Developing reliable pattern recognition requires calibrating your sensitivity to avoid both missing important signals and being distracted by false alarms. Scenario planning enhances pattern recognition by forcing you to think through how different combinations of factors might interact to create various future outcomes. Instead of trying to predict one specific future, you develop multiple plausible scenarios and identify the early warning
Order
signs
filled.
that would suggest each scenario is becoming more likely. This approach helps you recognize patterns as they're emerging, rather than only after they're fully
Order
established.
filled.
You become more sensitive to early signals because you've already thought through what those signals might indicate. For each scenario, identify the key variables that would drive that outcome and the early indicators that would suggest those variables are changing in the predicted direction. Then monitor those indicators systematically and update your scenario probabilities as new information becomes available. Cross-domain pattern recognition involves identifying structural similarities between apparently different fields. The same underlying patterns often appear in business, biology, psychology, physics, and social
Order
systems.
filled.
When you recognize these cross-domain patterns, you can transfer insights from areas where patterns are well understood to areas where they're just beginning to emerge. For example, network effects appear in technology platforms, social movements, ecosystem development, and immune system responses. Understanding how network effects work
Order
in one
filled.
domain helps you recognize and anticipate them in other domains. Viral spread patterns appear in infectious diseases, social media content, innovation adoption, and financial contagion. The mathematical models that describe viral spread in epidemiology can provide insights into how ideas, technologies, or market panics might spread through social and economic networks. Anti-fragility patterns appear in biological systems, technological development, and organizational design. Systems that become stronger under stress, rather than merely surviving it. Recognizing anti-fragile patterns helps you design strategies that benefit from uncertainty and volatility rather than just defending against them. Cycle recognition is particularly valuable for timing decisions and managing resources. Many patterns are cyclical, repeating with relatively predictable rhythms. Economic cycles, fashion cycles, political cycles, and personal energy cycles all follow recognizable patterns that can inform strategic timing. The key insight about cycles is that their emotional and psychological components are often more predictable than their specific technical details. Even when you can't predict exactly when a market cycle will turn, you can often recognize when sentiment has reached unsustainable extremes that typically precede reversals. Pattern degradation is equally important to recognize. Patterns that have been reliable in the past don't necessarily remain reliable forever. Changes in underlying conditions can make previously predictive patterns less useful or even misleading. Technology disruption often works by breaking patterns that seemed permanent. The rise of digital photography eliminated patterns that had governed the film industry for decades. Social media transformed communication patterns that had been stable for generations. Stay alert for signs that your recognized patterns might be losing their predictive power. When established patterns start producing unexpected results,
See, at this
it's
point,
often a signal that underlying
I'm gonna have to leave
conditions have
the trade to run
changed and new patterds are emerging.
with the two
Chapter
parts
8.
right there, but obviously,
Advanced Problem Decomposition Techniques.
let's see if we can just get
Complex
the function.
problems often feel overwhelming because
Now
your
we're
brain
taking out the
perceives
high.
them as single,
Let's see.
massive challenges
And
rather
then
than
our CPU is
collections of
really high.
smaller, manageable components. Advanced problem decomposition transforms seemingly impossible challenges into systematic workflows where each component can be understood, analyzed, and addressed individually. The fundamental insight behind effective decomposition is that complexity is often an illusion created by interconnection rather than inherent difficulty. Most complex problems consist of multiple simple problems that interact with each other. When you try to solve everything simultaneously, the interactions create confusion and paralysis. When you decompose effectively, you can address each component
So I
systematically
can go at least
while
15
managing the
for the moment.
interactions explicitly.
I would have
Structural
solved that.
decomposition begins by identifying the core components of your problem and understanding how they relate to each other. This requires moving beyond surface descriptions to understand the underlying architecture of the challenge you're facing. Start by asking, what are the main subsystems or categories within this problem? For a business challenge, these might be market factors, internal capabilities, competitive dynamics, regulatory constraints, and financial requirements. For a personal challenge, these might be skills, gaps, resource limitations, emotional barriers, time constraints, and relationship factors. Once you've identified the main components, map the relationships between them. Which components influence which others? Where are the feedback loops? Which relationships are causal versus correlational? This relationship mapping often reveals that what seemed like one complex problem is actually several simpler problems with well-defined interaction patterns. Functional decomposition focuses on breaking down problems by the different functions or processes involved.
Now that payout there.
Instead of asking what the problem consists of, you ask what needs to happen to solve it. This approach is
100
particularly
points.
powerful for operational challenges where you need to design
Let's
or
go.
improve complex workflows.
This,
For
yeah,
each major
some part that
function,
thing is messed up, but
identify
I
the
think it's
inputs
catch
required,
niggas off.
the transformation that needs to occur,
That's gonna be all she wrote this
and the
morning.
outputs that should result.
So,
Then break down each function into sub-functions until you reach a level where each component is clearly actionable. This approach often reveals hidden dependencies and resource requirements that weren't obvious when viewing the problem holistically. It also helps you identify which functions are critical path activities that could bottleneck your entire solution if not addressed adequately. Temporal decomposition involves breaking problems down by time horizons and sequencing. Many problems feel overwhelming because they mix immediate, urgent issues with long-term strategic challenges. Separating these temporal layers allows you to address each layer with appropriate tools and timelines. Identify which aspects of your problem need immediate attention, which require medium-term development, and which involve long-term positioning. Create separate work streams for each time horizon while maintaining coordination between them. This temporal separation often reveals that some seemingly urgent issues are actually symptoms of long-term problems that require strategic solutions, while some seemingly strategic issues have immediate implications that need tactical responses. Constraint-based decomposition focuses on identifying and categorizing the different types of limitations you're facing. Constraints often interact in complex ways, making problems seem more difficult than they actually are. When you identify and categorize constraints explicitly, you can often find ways to address them systematically or work around them creatively. Theory of constraints analysis helps you identify which constraint is currently limiting your progress most severely. Once you address the primary constraint, a different constraint typically becomes the limiting factor. This approach prevents you from wasting effort on improvements that won't actually increase your overall performance.
Not gonna stay
Some
here.
constraints are immutable facts of nature or law that you must
My day
accept
too,
and
so
work around. Others are resource limitations that could be addressed
just need
with
2 more
sufficient
days.
investment.
150.
Still others are
Activate the
self-imposed restrictions based on assumptions
activate the
that
payout.
could be questioned or beliefs that could be changed.
So yeah,
Stakeholder decomposition involves identifying all the
should have
different
never
people
taken a
or
loss.
groups
They
who
just messed me up
influence
with
or are
the
influenced by your
position
problem.
bracket boost.
Complex problems
Cleaners.
often remain unsolved
Alright though.
because solution attempts ignore important
Done over
stakeholders
$300 this month.
or fail to understand their different perspectives and incentives. Map out all the stakeholders. Understand their interests and concerns. Identify potential conflicts between different stakeholder groups and design solutions that address the legitimate needs of all important parties. This stakeholder analysis often reveals that technical solutions fail not because they don't work, but because they don't account for the human and political dynamics surrounding the problem. Root cause decomposition uses systematic analysis to identify the fundamental drivers behind surface problems. Most visible problems are symptoms of deeper issues. Addressing symptoms provides temporary relief, but doesn't prevent the problem from recurring. The 5 whys technique involves